started, appropriated, or modified many buildings in the city that we now think are Constantinian, and I want to dwell a little bit on that. So first, he modified baths of Constantine and founded them, in a sense. The Arch of Constantine, ironically, the Conservatory Constantine, again, ironically, and other buildings such as the Rotunda Complex, the location itself of the Lateran Basilica, some appropriations of the Neronian Colossus, which of course doesn't exist anymore, and the quadrifrontal arch in the Bellabrum. There's this fantastic article by Elizabeth Marlowe, published a long time ago, 12 years ago, that explains or details how this came about and how then Constantine consumed all of this. So I wanted just to focus very briefly on Constantine's appropriation of this imagery and all this building program after he defeated Maxentius in the very famous battle of the Milvian Bridge. So in this bronze coin that you can see here, it's basically the same as Maxentius, but there are just very few changes. Well, the first is that, of course, this is no longer Maxentius, but Constantine. We can tell it because of the beard, and of course, because of the inscription. And also, instead of saying conservator urbis suae, it says liberator urbis suae. That is, he is he who freed the city from the yoke of tyrannical oppression. Now, I would say that Constantine's program of reappropriation was largely successful. And this is very clear from the fact that we called the Basilica of Constantine like that until very recently, when we discovered that perhaps Constantine had not done much to build the structure, but instead he had appropriated it from the remnants of what Maxentius had left. But it was also, in a sense, unsuccessful. And what I want to point out here is that if it weren't for this passage, we would say, okay, Constantine completely devoured the presence of this recent past, of this recent Maxentian past. But we now know, because again of Aurelius Victor, that these buildings and many other, as recent archaeological research proves, were not Constantinian in origin. So I want to come up with a very short, brief explanation of why we call Constantine a conditor or a founder. And it relies on three things, perhaps even more. There's this semantic field of cognates, conservator, liberator, conditor, in the sense of, okay, they come somewhat close together in a semantic field. There's also an iconographical tradition at play here, of which Constantine is taking part. And finally, and most importantly, I want to argue that the numismatic medium makes itself available to view not for contemplation, but for transaction. That is, we should consider the fact that this material medium is not only something that we as historians want to analyze in an iconographical fashion and very slowly and detailed and with much detail say, okay, this says this or this and that, but we should also consider the way in which media itself is or contains within itself data processing ability. And here, of course, I am borrowing from Friedrich Kittler. So Maxentius really emerges again, struck through. Constantine's effort of appropriating this Maxentian past is just highlighting the way in which the past can emerge on itself through its own means. This is a statue found of Maxentius, and the statue itself was drowned in the same way that the body of Maxentius drowned in the Tiber River. Yet we managed to find it again, or I would say it found us again, and yet it endures. So I now want to comment briefly three things on the theory of presence based on, well, this and more evidence. Well, the first is, this can relate to Verbergt, or I don't really know how to pronounce that, but okay, and his typology of meaning and presence cultures. And you are, of course, very familiar with the argument, but he's basically saying that there's a culture that has not experienced an ontological break between past and present, and that is a presence culture, and there's a culture that has clearly experienced this ontological break. And what that means is that this culture must refer to or must contact history as a form or as an explanation for present things, and through the trope of metaphor. But instead, I think that we need to consider how both cultures generate a distance, and this generation of distance makes also possible an act of presence that it's actually surreptitious, and also it's actually an eruption, and it's not just a constant being there. And I would also like to comment, secondly, on the idea of sublimity. Of course, I'm commenting here on Anker Smith's sublime historical experience. And I wish to argue that the contact with the past is not epiphanic or fleeting. It is quotidian, in the same way that the structures of our culture seem to avoid our gaze. The past is always already presupposed. The fish in water does not realize the density of its medium until it is taken away from the medium. So we as bodies are embedded in the dense media of the past. And the past reappears all the time without it having to be an epiphany, but it's just blinded to us precisely because it's so quotidian. And here maybe it's, I think, the most interesting or most important part of my presentation. We tend to think of this presence, something that goes beyond language, something that is achieved through language and that breaks its barriers, and therefore it's sublime and it's ineffable. We talk about a beyond of language. We want to go beyond language, but media highlights the fact that the past is quotidian, that it is obvious, that it is a before language. So I hesitated a lot on bringing this concept, but here it is. It's some problems that this conception of the presence of the past brings about when thinking like presentification. I want to read a quote from Gombrich. He says, the possibility, so presentification is the possibility of speaking to the death or touching the objects of the world. So if we conceptualized presentification, or the act of making itself present or making the past present, like this, in this structure of transitivity, we go into the past. To get to the past, we are falling back to the problem of the 70s or 60s, perhaps 70s and 80s, of chasing the golden reference, right? Like trying to finally achieve the past without acknowledging that the presence and absence are binaries in this very Derridian structure. So final comment on media as history writers. Nietzsche, this is a very famous quote made famous by Hitler, wrote when he was in the final days of his life, our writing tools are also working on our thoughts. And he owned this writing ball by a Danish manufacturer. And it is already clear and perhaps obvious how media physicalities or materialities affect the construction of discourses. But I have the suspicion that we have not yet grasped its full implications. And I want to bring yet another quote from Heidegger, in which he says that the work of art is not really something we should, let's say, analyze and contemplate, etc., but it's a work which allows the god, talking about Greek statuary, himself to presence and is therefore the god himself. And so my suspicion here is that the same can be said about the past. It's not the god that it's making itself present anymore, but it's, or not only, but it's also how the past can make itself present at all times, precisely because the past is the media that we have about it. So the realization to which we have come to is that the past sneaks itself and writes itself, and there's this polysemy of writing in this perhaps originary sense of graphing, which is not only writing but drawing but inscribing itself. And also, and of course what Hitler would have thought, it's also the turning on and off of a switch. And to close up, of course, this is inspired in Ilkko Runia, again, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Ilkko Runia's contribution already 15 or 16 years ago in the History and Theory journal. But I don't think that the past hides in this cultural blind spots. Instead, I think that the past is not really hiding from sight. The past is already there, but it is our inability to synchronize with the frequencies, the vibrations of this past that makes it unavailable. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gabriel, for this inspiring talk. We'll proceed with a presentation by Professor Amado Manuel Cortés, who is here with us today. He is a professor at the College of History of the Faculty of Philosophy and Letters of the BUAP University here in Puebla. Professor Cortés has worked as a cataloger researcher at the Biblioteca Palafoxiana from 2000 to 2004, and he has published work on the culture of the book and Indian historiography, among other topics also on the authorship of Miradas a la cultura del libro en Puebla, and on libraries, typographers, engravers, booksellers, and editions in the colonial era. His lines of research are book history and library history, as well as colonial historiography and the theory of history. Today, Professor Cortés will present in Spanish. You can start.
Gracias. Bueno, esta ponencia la voy a dictar en español. Primero voy a señalar una cosa. En el programa viene un título que a veces se nos fue la tipografía, los que estamos trabajando en este evento. Aparece como Entre invención y transfiguración, el indio visto por la historiografía occidental. En realidad el título es Entre invención y construcción, una visión del discurso occidental sobre el indio. Bueno, quiero señalar que esta ponencia o esta discusión gira a través de cómo los discursos que se produjeron a partir de 1492 prácticamente han permanecido en el ámbito de la nación mexicana sin cambio alguno. ¿Qué quiero decir con esto? Que prácticamente el discurso que se ha creado en torno al indio, al indígena, ha sido un discurso que se ha heredado y que poco los historiadores o los pensadores han reflexionado en torno a esta idea. A partir de esta condición, quiero señalar algunos aspectos que me parecen fundamentales para que se pueda entender qué tipo de discurso es, qué tipo de discurso se sigue. Bueno, a partir de 1492, en Europa, prácticamente América no aparece, está fuera de su horizonte. Es decir, a partir de 1492 aparece América en el discurso occidental. Pero este discurso que aparece es un discurso de la alteridad, es decir, donde quien habla es el europeo y los silencios que se guardan tiene que ver con la población originaria o los indígenas. Es decir, el discurso que se ha mantenido a partir de 1492 es el discurso montado en una idea cristiana occidental. A partir de esta idea, yo me he dedicado a estudiar cómo las obras de evangelizadores, de cronistas, de la conquista, en el caso mexicano, ha sobrevivido en el ámbito académico y difícilmente se ha debatido, por una sencilla razón, porque se ha validado este discurso. Es decir, a partir de la óptica, en el sentido de que ellos son testigos presenciales del acontecimiento, por lo tanto, hay que validar este discurso. Sin embargo, a partir de las últimas décadas, en México, un grupo de especialistas se han centrado a discutir esa problemática, que es cómo se ha construido este discurso, bajo qué condiciones ha dominado este discurso, sobre todo en el ámbito académico, que es la condición donde nos preocupa. Voy a señalar. A partir de 1492 y en el caso del mexicano 1521 se ha construido un discurso teológico donde se ha señalado al indígena como un ser diabólico, como un ser satánico. Es decir, se ha construido al otro bajo la visión teológica cristiana. Bueno, incluso más adelante a los indígenas se les ha construido como menores de edad. Es decir, son pequeños, son gente que sigue las condiciones de los evangelizadores. Prácticamente estamos viendo cómo se construye la imagen dócil del indígena. Es decir, una imagen que se construye a partir de crónicas religiosas. Eso ha sido parte de nuestra herencia. Bueno, puedo señalar también dentro de las crónicas que escribieron estos españoles evangelizadores la idea del sacrificio humano. Una de las condiciones que hoy se tiene que estar debatiendo es esta idea del sacrificio humano, porque prácticamente a estos pueblos americanos se les ha dado esta categoría de que sacrificaban en gran cantidad, sobre todo a una población como es el pueblo náhuatl o el pueblo azteca, prácticamente se le pone como los bárbaros. Es decir, la condición de conquista y evangelización va en esta idea de erradicar este satanismo. Pero en realidad el discurso que se está construyendo es un discurso que, por cierto, está muy ligado al mundo antiguo y está muy ligado al discurso medieval. Sobre todo si estudiamos las crónicas que tienen que ver con la conquista del Islam, prácticamente es el mismo discurso. Lean las crónicas que hablan sobre la reconquista española y se van a dar cuenta que es un discurso que se transpola. Bueno, es decir, es un discurso donde hay que combatir la herejía, pero hay que revisar un poquito más el discurso occidental. Todo el discurso occidental medieval habla de sacrificios humanos. Por ejemplo, se presenta la peste negra y son los judíos quienes sacrifican niños y contaminan los pozos. Si nos vamos más adelante en el siglo XV, siglo XVI, ya no van a ser los judíos, ahora van a ser las mujeres. Son las brujas que hacen sacrificios, ¿no? Siempre la idea del sacrificio está presente en la cultura occidental. Y eso es la herencia que se tiene para las culturas mesoamericanas a las culturas americanas. Bueno, ahora, esto es en un primer momento. Si nosotros nos trasladamos para el siglo XVIII, la idea ya no tiene que ver con el mundo español, sino ahora tiene que ver con otra condición occidental, tiene que ver con la ilustración. Es decir, ya acá se deja el fenómeno de la condición de sacrificios, se deja el fenómeno de la idea satánica, la idea diabólica, y ahora aparece un nuevo discurso que tiene que ver con la idea de progreso. Es decir, ahora las nuevas sociedades no alcanzan su mayoría de edad por una sencilla razón, porque no están educados. Sin embargo, si nosotros nos centramos en esta discusión que se presentó en Europa, sobre todo en el lado francés, pueden entender cómo se construyen dos versiones sobre los indígenas. Por un lado vamos a encontrar el buen salvaje. Esta idea del buen salvaje tiene que ver con este indígena se puede transformar si los educamos. Por otro lado, vamos a encontrar otros conceptos que van a aparecer de gente mucho más radical. Me estoy refiriendo a otros pensadores ilustrados, como va a ser De Pauw, este famoso escritor de los Países Bajos, que va a decir, no, estos indígenas en realidad van a ser siempre personas atrasadas, pero aquí se centra la discusión en el problema del clima. Van a decir, como es un mundo nuevo, no lograron que todas las aguas se secaron, entonces las tierras americanas están llenas de condiciones pantanosas, por lo tanto, su progreso es nulo, ¿no? Bueno, sin embargo, también van a tocar al lado español, porque van a decir, todos los españoles que están en América ya se han contaminado. Es decir, han adquirido las características de los indígenas. Bueno, estas dos son las visiones que se tienen en el caso del discurso historiográfico que se ha producido desde el siglo XVI, XVII, XVIII. Y por cierto, para nosotros es dramático porque nadie lo ha puesto a discusión, salvo algunos académicos, por cierto, puedo citar, Guy Rosat, Alfonso Mendiola, Norma Durán, son de los pocos estudiosos que se han centrado en deconstruir este discurso, porque la mayoría de los pensadores mexicanos y académicos mexicanos siguen sosteniendo estas versiones. Pero acá viene todo un problema. ¿Por qué? El gran problema es que no se leen bien los textos que se produjeron a lo largo del siglo XVI y siglo XVII. Es decir, estos documentos se leen como si fueran textos modernos y no logran centrarse en la condición cultural que generó estos documentos. Es decir, si nosotros revisamos, por ejemplo, todas las crónicas de conquista, todas las crónicas de evangelización, se van a dar cuenta de la categoría medieval con la cual están inscritas, la idea de la salvación. Esta idea de la salvación, por supuesto, está muy presente en Europa, se puede observar. Primero, está el gran problema que está generando Lutero, que está rompiendo con la cristiandad. Por lo tanto, España encuentra aquí un gran premio que es encontrar indígenas para sustituir las personas que han abandonado esta cristiandad. Pero, como España se ha colocado como el pueblo elegido, va a construir todo un discurso racial, teológico, que por cierto, repito, todavía no nos hemos centrado a discutir esta problemática. La otra condición, obviamente, que también parte con los debates que van a tener contra España, es decir, España, la gran defensora de la cristiandad, por supuesto que no va a tener una condición ilustrada, por supuesto, pues va en contra de sus posiciones, ¿no? Entonces, prácticamente se ha construido un discurso de América y en particular de lo que va a ser México en un futuro que todavía cargamos. Voy a señalar algunos aspectos. Por ejemplo, el mundo indígena construye artesanías, no arte. El mundo indígena es folclore, no es civilización. Incluso más adelante, el concepto de civilización va a arrojar ahora las categorías de primero, segundo y tercer mundo. Bueno, esto se asimila en las condiciones económicas, pero por supuesto también lo vamos a tener en las condiciones culturales. Es decir, la condición xenofóbica que se va a tener, por ejemplo, a las poblaciones que hablan una lengua, incluso hay formas despectivas que se tienen en el mismo origen, es decir, en la misma condición mexicana con las cuales nos comportamos y muchas veces hacemos menos a la población indígena, por la condición de piel, por la condición de lengua. Es decir, estamos hablando de un discurso que ha permanecido estático y que obviamente tenemos mucho que hacer para deconstruir esta visión que, por cierto, no permite generar precisamente discusión, porque sigue siendo un discurso que gira en torno a la misma idea, es decir, a la misma condición que se produjo a partir del siglo XVI. Por lo tanto, creo yo que los discursos que tenemos que hacer en el caso de la historiografía mexicana es precisamente entrar de lleno, analizar todo este discurso que se ha configurado y que, por cierto, es un discurso erróneo, tanto lo que producen los europeos occidentales como lo que se produce en América Latina. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Professor Cortés, for this talk. We'll now listen to Professor Eugenia Gay. She is a professor in the methodology of history at the National University of Córdoba. She has obtained the CAPES Note 10 scholarship and has been professor in Rio de Janeiro, and she participated in research projects on Brazilian historiography and the philosophy of history. She has published widely, and maybe perhaps also wildly, on topics ranging from historiographic criticism to an article on the Fisher debate. Her lines of research are European intellectual history, with a focus on the aesthetics of the 18th century in Germany and its relationship with the conformation of academic historiography, the philosophical hermeneutics of Hans-Georg Gadamer, and the history of concepts of Reinhard Koselleck. Today, Professor Gay will speak about more than meets the fact on a case of mediation as subtext history.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that presentation. Widely indeed, as it was defined by my PhD orientator. So anyway, I will present now. I apologize, I will read because what I'm about to present is a paper that has changed a lot since I first sent it the abstract, and has outgrown the limits of an oral presentation, but and I'm not willing to give up any parts of that argument. So I've organized it very tightly in a written paper, and I still mean to argue about mediation as something that is not limited to the format we choose to convey or present the findings of our research. Rather, I would risk to say that there is no action in the historiographical operation that cannot be defined as mediation. This paper changed a lot about a year ago when I was invited to take part in a seminar about the essence of history, of which I was uninvited afterwards for some reason. But nevertheless, it gave me the opportunity to reflect on whether what we do in Latin America belongs to the same order of things of what Europeans call history or historiography. I realized that there are a set of presuppositions, pre-assumptions that are structural in European historiography, which make it impossible to achieve a similarly true history in Latin America. Our attempts to conform to the demands of a universal definition of history lead us to histories that don't express the reality we presume to portray, and that this situation is complicated by our Latin American historians, as Professor Cortés put it recently very clearly, not being that radical other, but instead some kind of a hybrid that, mainly because of our education and middle-class origin, both shares the expectation of universality of European historians and struggles to adapt the observed reality to the essentialized organization of the discipline in Europe and in the States. This is because, I would like to propose, the essence of history is not in a complete history or endless process which can eventually provide a single meaning for the manifold of human experience. On the contrary, history's essence is communal. It can be found in the shared perplexity produced by the realization of the impossibility to find a meaningful structure. This prevents us, no matter how much we try, from subsuming all phenomena into one single movement. I believe the expectation of finding a single encompassing history produces a blindness that is not inherent to, but describes most historiography after historicism. Such attempt at transforming speculative philosophies into a craft capable of achieving a total account of the infinite singularity of life had two outcomes. One was the loss of the individuality and uniqueness of every singular manifestation of life in order to make it into a grand design. And the other one was the conception of knowledge and consequently of truth as the eventually to be achieved sum total of all the individual events that we can recover from the past. None of these results can be considered as an appropriate fulfillment of history's promise or supposed goal, to give meaning to human experience in the world. The problem or the aporia of the unity versus diversity has been the object of many an argument, but as Edmundo Gorman, Mexican historian, has pointed, the problem has never been solved, but instead avoided. I will propose that to make the problem of a general history productive from our, again, Latin American historians' hermeneutic situation, it's imperative to consider the colonial print contained in the unitary vision of history, something we can call, following a long line of thinkers, the colonial mediation, which constitutes an unspoken subtext to all our histories. As we all know, the idea of progress contained in the modern scientific paradigm is an essential part of our unitary conception of history. It conditioned non-European historiography in two complementary ways. First, as a unitary process, history found its meaningful center in Europe. the expansion of which entailed also the addition of new territories to its history, together with the suppression of other histories in order to accommodate the new phenomena in its own historical grand narrative. Second, and most importantly, I see you typing, I'm getting nervous. No, I see the questions coming. Second, and most importantly, non-European history came to be understood as local history, in contrast to general history, and therefore meaning in local histories became adjacent, alternative, or complementary, always as compared to the European meaning of history. That is, European history became the normative meaning, and this in turn became the benchmark for the understanding of any other non-European histories. With modernity, Europe came to be not only the origin of history, both in the temporal sense, as in history was born in Mesopotamia or Greece, and prior to that, not even things are not considered history, as Guillermo Cermeño pointed the other day when he said, there is time without history. And in the spatial sense, as in the great march of civilization coincides with the expansion of Europe. And also in the epistemological sense, for meaning is analyzed from the starting point of the configuration of meaning in the European conception of historical reason. As a result, non-European history and its epistemological constructions are often evaluated and discarded as backward, as something that has already been overcome by the avant-garde of European theory or philosophy of history, both in the origin and the beacon of historical thinking. As Chakrabarty has repeatedly shown, modernity, nation-state, reason, science, and even history are words that describe processes and cultural standards in Europe and not necessarily in the rest of the world. However, given Europe's colonial ventures, these concepts have been applied or rather imposed upon peoples, territories and cultures which now, after centuries of colonial prints and centuries of independent standing, still describe themselves as nation-states, ponder their role in European modernity, and build their own histories all according to European standards. In his classic study, Chakrabarty concludes that this has produced histories as well as actual nation-states that lack something when compared to European ones. Having Europe as standard reference creates histories that are, to say the least, an accessory to main history, considered as universal standard of historical development and historical categories and concepts. Most importantly, the idea of a normal, a standard, against which every other process must be compared, measured against, or otherwise overwritten, has an epistemological correlate in the logic of concept building, and it is here that the subtext lays. Concepts and categories are not the results of the consideration of different experiences in a Habermasian neutral arena from which a common denominator is extracted, as the methodology manual reads. Rather, it is the setting of a standard after a single case, which becomes relevant for reasons that are historical, that is political, economical, cultural, and social. And every following modification of the concept is made by deciding if the new, not necessarily chronologically subsequent, case can and should be incorporated to or defined in relation to the original concept. This is science's universalization mechanism by which the objective standard is stipulated. Moreover, this constitutes the colonial act, as Todorov showed when noting that Columbus was more interested in finding the exact Spanish equivalent of the indigenous word cacique than in understanding its meaning in the hierarchy. As, quote, if the Spanish usage were not one convention among others, but rather the natural state of things. What we can learn from that is how concepts and categories are not neutral. They carry the load of colonialism in its very definition. It is something that we can most properly designate as a historical marking that belongs to the longue durée of our current historical situation. It shows in the fact that categories produced in other parts of the world are rarely adopted in standard European history, unless they're negative. One good example of the, I will give two, of the standard epistemological procedure is the building of the concept of genocide. It was only after many years of thinking about Nazism that I myself realized why had been such a defining moment of world history, being, as it was, one more example of an attempt of extermination, such as the invasion of America or the Condor Plan in Latin America. And the reason that Nazism was so often used to describe or understand processes such as the Latin American dictatorships, which were also attempts of extermination, is that it happened in Europe, and it involved US interest, and its monumentalization served a political purpose. If we go through the history of the concept of genocide, we will discover that it's not easily applied to any other extermination event. And this has been historiographically processed as a distinctive characteristic of this particular event in terms of the debate over the uniqueness of the Holocaust. The consequence being that genocidal attempts, successful or not, outside of Europe are considered quasi-genocide. Genocide, but not quite. We can look, but we will not find interpretations of Nazism that use the pattern or the categories of other authoritarian genocidal regimes to understand it. The exception being the Armenian genocide, which also happened in Europe and also came to involve certain political interests when Turkey became a political issue. Nazism is the standard for criminal authoritarian ideology. Hitler and maybe also Stalin, as defined by European historians, especially Entre, are the standards for the evil leader. The extermination of the European Jews is the base for the definition of genocide, and its application to any other seemingly genocidal process will have to pass the scrutiny of experts that will judge it according to the standard. The Nazi genocide has become a model of interpretation in many ways. In a previous work, which I was going to present here, I tried to show how the Nazi experience produced a series of categories that constitute the subtext that commanded the interpretation of other violent disruptions of the social bond. In examining the Argentinian experience, I proposed the connection between the Argentinian dictatorship and Nazism ended up casting a constellation of archetypes that served not precisely as interpretation, but as a commonsensical base for interpretation in the Argentinian case. These were the rhetoric of silence that described the argued but not so quiet silence after the return to normal, the extrapolation of trauma, which occluded the political agendas and alliances that allowed impunity, the dialectic of the two demons that rebalanced the responsibilities between supposedly equally dangerous contenders, and finally, the allegory of the captive population and the evil leader, which restricted the responsibility of the criminal events taking place to a small number of deranged or monstrous individuals. It is unsettling to see how any phenomenon that doesn't fit this accepted pattern is discarded, and how narrative is built that doesn't really agree with the document's individual memories or perceptions of participants, and yet becomes the accepted academic common sense interpretation of entire periods. Nothing I have said is new. As Franz Fanon explained in the 60s, the characterization of a culture as lacking is nothing but the colonial footprint itself. For to colonize is not only to obliterate the colonized culture, but to make the colonized acknowledge the inherent inferiority of its culture. Has the acknowledgement of this situation transformed the way in which we think about history at all? Has it modified the practice of history in any way? Apparently not so, as Professor Cortés put it. In fact, the only Latin American historians or theoreticians that have any presence in the European scene are those who discuss only with European or American theories, problems, agendas, and theoreticians. The South-South dialogue, or the colonized-colonized dialogue, seems to receive no attention whatsoever in European or American historiography, unless taken as a case. Is the historical discipline's endeavor then truly universal, or is it the result of the long years of colonial relationship institutionalized in universities, publishing requirements, scientific standards, and funding institutions? Undertakings such as Chakrabarty and the post-colonial movements, the decoloniality project, the indigenous movement, the sociology of imagery, and many others have drawn our attention to the possibility that, more than a defective or limp science, or even worse, a defective reality, doesn't fit it, the procedures, categories, and especially expectations of what is to be found simply cannot describe the reality of many non-European cultures. In other words, it is the lens that is faulty, not the reality it examines, and what is particularly wrong with it is its presupposition of universality. This being the state of affairs, we have several challenges. This is not just whining. that could constitute a decolonial historical agenda. The first one should be to achieve a better understanding of what Latin American histories have in common, without implying or constructing an essentialized unit of analysis under the denomination of Latin America, as it has so often happened. Rather, we could explore the possibility of the existence of a common set of academic presuppositions. As mostly white in the Latin American context, scholars educated in universities with European models and syllabuses, we cannot claim indigenous thinking as our own. See, for example, John Pemberton's, quoted by Stefan Berger, book on ceremonies associated with Javanese kinship. We all know more, indeed, about the first industrial revolution than about the Inca state. Even our notion of non-colonial history is colonial. Our main or first references to begin to think in a non-colonial history are Dipesh Chakrabarty and Edward Said, scholars that not only speak English as a first language, but are the symbol of the provocative scholar embraced by the European tradition. How do we avoid essentializing what decolonial theory has tried so hard to de-essentialize? Perhaps instead of looking for common patterns, we should look for problematic, non-transferable categories that we have applied. The allegory of the evil leader that we mentioned above is a good example of such procedure. We said that the interpretation of Argentinian dictatorship takes after the Holocaust pattern, with one big difference. Holocaust scholarship takes Hitler and the Nazi leadership as main responsible figures for the genocide. But Argentinian history does not take Videla, Viola, and Viñona, the joint armed forces leaders, as the main responsible names for the catastrophe that took place in Argentina. According to the traditional narrative about dictatorship, the ultimate responsible individual for the catastrophe was indeed President Perón, who died in 1974, that is 2 years before the coup. This is a revealing difference. It shows how this learned and installed epistemological pattern creates a commonsensical base for interpretation, and how it can accommodate a narrative that is profoundly politically charged, making it acceptable and true, not less because of its familiarity, both in academic and lay environments. I believe there are a series of unspoken consensus and points of view which serve as an embedded subtext of Latin American history that we should pay attention to. I will not come into this, I will just name them. And they are, first, the experience of inequality. We can talk further about this. Second, the presupposition of emptiness, of Latin America, of course. The concept of development, as Professor Cortés pointed before. The idea of civilization. The idea of modernity. And finally, the concept of tradition. These constitute transversal themes, categories that have been applied in a way that does not fit the Latin American reality, that are not limited to specific fields and could help us start the debate about what an agenda of decolonial historiography that allows us to grasp the subtext could look like. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much for this inspiring talk. We'll now proceed with our last talk before we then get to the discussion. The last talk will be given by Stefan Berger, who is the director of the Institute for Social Movements at the Ruhr University in Bochum in Germany. He is a professor of social history and specializes in nationalism and national identity studies, historiography and historical theory, comparative labor studies, and history of industrial heritage. Rather than listing his many publications, among which are several volumes in the series on Writing the Nation, I would like to point out that Professor Berger is presenting his newest book, History and Identity, How Historical Theory Shapes Historical Practice, at this conference later this afternoon at 4:30 in this room. Now Professor Berger will speak about remediating trade union history as a resource for trade unionism in Germany. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thanks to the organizers, especially the local organizers. I think, as many have said, this has been so far a very terrific event, extremely well organized, and I'm very pleased to be here. What I want to do is to report a little bit on an ongoing project of remediating the history of the trade union movement in Germany. And as we have so many specialists here on questions of remediation, it would be nice to receive some feedback and some criticism of this project. Perhaps to start off with, in terms of my own positionality, I'm a practicing labor historian. I started my academic life as a labor historian, and have always been keen to write a kind of history which engages also with the public and with the world of politics, which is why I'm currently also a member of the History Commission of the German Social Democratic Party. I'm an advisor to the German Trade Union Confederation, the Deutsche Gewerkschaftsbund, the DGB, and also an advisor to the regional body responsible for administering the Ruhr region of Germany, the Regionalverband Ruhr. So I'm speaking as a historian, but I guess also as a kind of person who's been interested in bringing history to the public. And in doing this, I have always tried, at least, to be informed by theoretical perspectives on the writing of history, and increasingly also on memory, which I tend to see very much as two sides of the same coin. Recently, between 2018 and 2021, I chaired a commission instigated by the head of the German trade union movement, Rainer Hoffmann, and the commission was to look into the ways in which the history of the trade unions is presented and represented in German public life. There were 14 members of that commission. 7 of them were professional historians, and 7 of them were representatives of the 7 biggest unions that are under the umbrella of the DGB, of the German trade union movement. The topics we looked at were topics ranging from the history of the trade unions themselves, how they are presented in the public, to particular aspects of trade unionism, such as co-determination in Germany, the specific form of corporatism that was established in West Germany after 1945, to the history of strikes and the history of wage bargaining, collective wage bargaining, but also at more general issues such as the role of trade unions in the building of the welfare state, or the role of trade unions in the building of the European Union, or the role of the trade unions in their relationship with other progressive social movements in Germany. So there were a variety of different topics that we examined, and the book, which will summarize all of these results, so the sort of researches that were carried out by more than 20 scholars, is being published this month in the series of the Hans Böckler Foundation, which is the major trade union foundation in Germany, in German. And so for those of you who don't know German, it's a bit difficult to access this. But in a way, there is also an English language summary of the results of the commission on the website of the Hans Böckler Foundation. I won't go into the exact details of the results. Suffice it to say that the end result, if we want to put it in a nutshell, is that it looks pretty bad. The memory and history of German trade unions is largely absent in the public sphere in Germany. Maybe just one example: if Germans hear about the welfare state, they think first and foremost about Bismarck as the creator of the welfare state. The enormous role of the trade unions in bringing about what we now have in Germany in terms of a welfare state is largely not present. And that's just one example. I mean, the DGB Sachsen a couple of years ago did a film, and the film went into a particular type of school in Germany, which is for the apprentices working in the factories, because under the dual system in Germany, if you do an apprenticeship, you work in the factory for 3 days a week and you go to school for 2 days a week. So these are the typical future members of German trade unions. And asked what they understood by a trade union, most of them understood nothing by a trade union. They had never heard of trade unions. In fact, one of them said, "Trade unions, isn't that something for professors?" Well, I mean, it is something for professors, obviously, but nevertheless, it showed a widespread ignorance amongst one of the key constituents of the trade unions. So, how can we make the memory of trade unionism stronger, and how can we ensure that the history of trade unionism is present in the public sphere in a way that it reaches a wider target audience? And of course, what the Commission also emphasized throughout its work is that that presence of the trade unions, that aspired greater presence of the trade unions in the public sphere, should be a very self-reflective and self-critical presence. It should not be a straightforward triumphalist history of all of the wonderful achievements of the German trade unions, because of course we have to be aware of the complicity of trade unionism at certain times and certain places in things such as nationalism, xenophobia, and also a rather narrow self-seeking politics of the protection of their own, rather than in presenting a wider social vision in society. So if we ask ourselves how we can give trade unionism a greater presence in the public sphere, then I fear that historians writing more history books will not be enough. Although at the same time it is rather hopeful that we have seen, I think not just in Germany but internationally, a revival of labor history. Labor history, as many of you might know, was the kind of flavor of the month in the 1960s and 1970s, when it was also endowed with an overabundant optimism that the revolution was just around the corner, and that history writing had to make a contribution to that revolution. And when it emerged that it was not just around the corner, it went into a rather a deep sleep for a while, and there were institutions, in particular the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam, which kept the flag flying throughout the dark years of the 1980s and 1990s. But I think from the 2000s onwards, we see a slow revival. I've written about this elsewhere, which has a lot to do with the fact that labor history turned outward, that it was not so much concerned any longer with a simple story of organizations and institutions, but that it connected with various other fields of historical writing, which allowed it to make this, in some respects, amazing comeback. But again, I think it's good that we have that comeback, but I think history writing, academic history writing, professional history writing will certainly not be enough to achieve this aim of giving the trade unions a bigger place in the public sphere. So what is needed, I think, is a kind of transmedia strategy for bringing the concerns of the German trade union movement closer to the public in Germany. And together with the Hans Böckler Foundation, which is as I already mentioned, the main foundation of the trade unions. Maybe for those of you who are not familiar with the idea, it's in fact one of the biggest foundations in Germany, and it is funded largely through the money that trade unionists who sit on all of the governing boards of German companies receive as payment. They can't keep that money to themselves, but they give it to the Hans Böckler Foundation, and the Hans Böckler Foundation then funds all sorts of other things, including actually quite a bit on academic research, which they see as being of value to the trade union movement. So this process of creating this transmedia strategy has in some respects only just begun, because the results of the commission will be presented to the National Congress of the Trade Union Movement next month in Berlin, and we will then start to put into practice some of the recommendations of that commission. What we have in mind is to first of all look at the creation of specific memory sites in Germany, so that we create in places in which there have been specific struggles for the extension of political democracy to forms of economic democracy, where they have taken place and where they will hopefully in the future form a place for the memorialization of those struggles. Just to give you one example, in the area where I'm coming from, the Ruhr region in Germany, the largest industrial region, used to be the largest industrial region in Germany, very heavily based on coal and steel, the birthplace of German co-determination, a place with a long history of struggles of trade unions, which has been undergoing massive deindustrialization over the last half century. So coal is gone, steel is almost gone, but the region has been revitalized in some respects through an active strategy of structural transformation. And we have seen in the region the building of 700-kilometer long route of industrial heritage, which celebrates the industrial history of the region. This route of industrial heritage has become so popular that now about 7 million tourists every year visit the sites to do with industrial heritage. But these 7 million tourists at the moment, when they visit this route, learn nothing about German trade unionism. So together with the Regionalverband Ruhr, the organization which manages this route of industrial heritage, and with the trade unions, we will insert the memory of the struggles of trade unionism into this route, and thereby it hopefully will be able to tell those 7 million tourists also about the social struggles that the trade unions undertook in order to achieve this extension of economic democracy. I think that's one example. So the creation of specific sites of memory, of realms of memory, if you like, that will speak to the German public in ways that is absent at the moment. A second initiative has to do with bringing the trade unionism more into the museums. Because again, as part of this 3-year-long study, we looked at all of the major German history museums and some of the regional history museums as well. And again, we found that despite the fact that often trade unionists sit on the advisory boards of those museums, the history of trade unionism is not very well represented in the German history museums. So in a way, actualizing the power that the German trade unions still have in society, which also means sitting on these advisory boards, means that we need to develop active strategies for bringing the trade unionisms more into the museums. A similar case can be made for television, I mean, history is very much present in German television. It's, I think, for the British context, I can't remember who it was, someone a couple of years ago said that history was the new gardening on television. So we have a lot of history programs on television, but relatively few of them on trade unionism. There are exceptions to the rule. I don't know, some of you might know the wonderful series that was made by Arte, the French-German television station, on the history of the working class in Europe, which is very much an attempt to present the achievements of the history of the working class and its institutions to a wider audience. But like with the museums, we need to bring, if you like, this history closer to some of the institutions that can remediate that history to a wider audience. And then, of course, another major challenge is a much wider use of the social media by the trade unions, where again, it is largely absent at the moment. Trade union movement has created interesting websites. There is a website, again, for those of you who know German, Gewerkschaftsgeschichte.de, which is a website entirely dedicated to the history of German trade unionism within a wider social history framework of Germany from the 19th century to the present day. But at the moment, it looks very kind of old-fashioned, in terms of its didactics, and especially a younger generation, these people who are apprentices in modern-day companies, I very much doubt that they will be attracted to such a website. So we need a kind of more modern strategy that speaks to younger people in particular, and is capable of reaching them through the media that they currently use, including, I guess, Twitter and TikTok and Instagram, to ensure that this sort of history and the memory of trade unionism is present in an interesting and up-to-date way. And of course, we can only do this with the specialists. So in the autumn, we're having a workshop on possible social media uses towards a concerted social media strategy of the German trade union movements in presenting its history. And then finally, although this project is very much focused on Germany, we have been also recognizing from the start that, of course, the history of trade unionism has always been in parts an international history. German trade unions were behind the internationalization of the trade union movements before the outbreak of the First World War. They still today carry a large deal of the financial burden of maintaining international institutions such as Unite All or other international trade union federations. And so a final idea was to create an international forum for exchange and best practice through a web page where trade unions from around the world can present what they are actually doing in terms of history and memory of their movements and how they are trying to use history and memory to promote the aims of economic democracy. And this will be a multilingual website, because it's very clear from our discussions, especially our discussions in Latin America, that if we produce a website in English, it will not be of interest to trade unionists in Latin America. So we have to somehow deal with this challenge of multilingualism on this website, but we're hoping to build something that can serve as a discussion forum on how we can best achieve a kind of common aim, namely to defend an institution that, in particular in the neoliberal age, is often presented as a kind of last dinosaur of an industrial age and an institution that is no longer necessary. But if we can instead present the message that the trade unions have been and continue to be, in some respects, the strongest thing that the weak in society have, then I think we have served a useful purpose, I guess. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this very engaged talk. I think we really enjoyed it. We're also getting applause from the people at home. We now have some time for questions. Here in the room, we'll pass around the mic. I might need a volunteer who is willing to actually take it around. And then if we have any questions at home, you can just raise your hand on Zoom, and then I'll give you the word like that. I see we have one question here in the room. Perfect.
Still? Okay. Thank you very much, everyone, for the presentations. It was quite an intense experience. I don't even know where to begin with. I think I will begin with the toughest one, which is Eugenia, because I'm actually, I mean, I've been working into things that are very much close to this kind of reflection. Not to promote myself here, but I will be presenting later on, 4 o'clock, about a particular concept of hybridism, which I believe are very important. Hybridism, actually the Brazilian concept of mysticizing, but so concepts of hybridism, lack and excess, which I believe are very important in this colonial difference, like imagination. But anyways, okay, I'll try to, it's just one question, but with many questions in it. Okay, maybe go straight to the question. Is it possible for you to think historically in a non-Eurocentric way? Historically, or to do historical thinking in a non-Eurocentric way? And what would be your take into, I would like to hear more about this idea of South-South dialogue, but also things like global history, who seem to be attempting to bridge some of these issues or tackle some of these issues as well. And before I ask another question, I just would like to quote briefly a Brazilian literary critic, Silviano Santiago, who says in a very famous text, The Place in Between, O Entre Lugar do Discurso Latino-Americano, that under colonial circumstances or post-colonial circumstances, like in Brazil and Latin America, to write, to speak, is to write against, to speak against. So maybe something to think. Yeah. And for Gabriel, very quickly, I've noticed he used some words to refer to this relation between, or this thing that Constantine does with, or did with Maxentius. And you use the words anthropophagy, consumption, and devoured. And I'm interested in hearing more, why did you choose these words? And what kind of relation exactly these words describe? Thank you.
I suggest we let the speakers answer first, and then we'll go to the second question.
Oh, okay, I'll start. Well, thank you very much. Very interesting question about, is it possible to think historically in a non-Eurocentric way? Well, that was actually the question that was posed to me when I was asked to think about the essence of history. It's like, is there an essence? Is there a common goal? Is there a common set of definitions that we consider to be history and that apply both to what Europeans call history and what we call history? And what Zermenio said the other day, it was just at the end of his presentation, and he said, well, we have to start thinking there is history without time, but there is also time without history. And he was referring to all the experiences, especially in Latin America, that cannot be thought about in terms of European history. And I think that is a challenge. I think there is a great amount of authors that have been thinking about decolonial historiography and post-colonial historiography, which are not the same, but are things that can talk to each other. And I think the great mistake that we have been doing is to think against European history. I think if we keep on building a parallel agenda, which is what we have done from decolonial history and post-colonial history, that does not bother to engage European colleagues, we will still be a case. We will still be a parallel history. We will still be something that criticizes the norm. And I don't think that is productive anymore. I think we need to engage our colleagues. I think we need to try and set the agenda. So it's not really against, it's to find points that are common to European tradition and Latin American tradition, like these concepts I was mentioning before. Tradition is one of the key concepts. In European tradition, for example, just give this example. Tradition is seen as something bad, like something we have to think out of, and something that we need to avoid, we need to criticize and maybe forget is associated with conservative thinking. And I think in Latin America, I can speak for Latin America, I don't know, we have to to think that as a community, as a Latin American community, which I think it exists, but it's just an idea. We'll see if it exists. But tradition for us is the very essence of what we are. We build our identities on tradition. So to do away with tradition would be to do away with exactly what we have to deal with, right? And many times in a positive way. And how that I think there are some authors that are working in that right direction. One is De Souza Santos. I think his theory of abysmal thinking is a way to start thinking about how we build our European thinking about our native yet European thinking about Latin America, Latin American history. The other one is Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui from Bolivia. She has criticized deeply Evo Morales, even Evo Morales, I mean, she's to the left of Evo Morales, because she thinks that even though it was very good for Bolivia, what Evo brought was the European left paradigm into Latin American politics, and that is not what our countries are about. It's not what our indigenous heritage is about. It's not the way we should build our left or our progressive thinking, because it sets the standard of the European left. And that's very interesting to think in those terms, because it is one of those concepts or categories that we have applied because they were better than the ones we had, because they were progressive, but still do not speak of the reality they were trying to describe or produce. And the other one is Rita Segato. She lives in Brazil. She's Argentinian, but she's in the University of Brasilia. And what she brings to the conversation, and I think it's extremely important, the other part of another point I wanted to make and didn't have time to, is that she brings criticism from the feminist theory into historiography, something that has been encapsulated and put in a drawer and where it's safe, and has John Scott could be also brought here to the conversation, even though she's not Latin American. But they have criticisms that really go into the foundation of European history and that speak about this impossibility to treat all of history as a common, encompassing trail. So.
All right, I can give two answers. One is going to be really basic and material, and the second, I think I'm going to be a little bit more serious. The first is, of course, I mean, while I was writing this, I was taking my master's degree in the university, and we were studying precisely Latin American theory and all of this that I think you are referring to. And so, of course, it just surged again in my writing without me being very aware of it. The second and more serious answer has to do with, of course, this is a political movement of the temporal structures on how we understand time to pass and the people that populate that time to be remembered with. And so I do think that this is an anthropophagy in the original sense, it's like this, the thing that we as Latin Americans do at all times, I would say. But it also has this, the other pole of this word is we can consume the past, but it will continue to emerge from itself. And it's what I think that Constantine was doing. Like by consuming it, became just through a garb of Constantinian identity to an otherwise Maxentian, let's call material reality. So yeah, I actually think that even though it's the less serious answer, I do think that it's more the first, because I was not perhaps very aware of using like this Latin American theoretical term to discuss something that is, of course, considered to be the I forgot the English word, la cuna de la civilización, right? The birthplace of civilization, which of course is not, it's completely, but okay, that's another topic. So I suppose I answered your question unsatisfactorily, but that's about it.
Great, thank you.
Great, we'll now take another question from the room, and then I see there's also a question online, so we'll first do your question and then switch to Zoltan.
I'd like to congratulate the panel. It's really, really good. It's really good to think about those questions. First, I have a few very, very objective questions to each of the panelists. And to Gabriel. Gabriel, in one of your slides, you mentioned the word or the concept of agency. And I'd like to listen a little bit more about this. Amado, gracias por su ponencia. Fue muy interesante y muy elucidativa y tuvo mucho que ver con la ponencia de Eugenia. Pero a mí me gustaría saber si tiene una reflexión sobre la relación entre el discurso historiográfico y el discurso de la literatura, de la raza cósmica, de Ariel. Y hay todo un pensamiento latinoamericano que confronta justamente esta perspectiva. Entonces, me gustaría oír un poquito más sobre si hay en el grupo de estudios, en la línea de estudio, si hay un poco más sobre este acercamiento hacia el pensamiento clásico latinoamericano. Eugenia, switch off. Eugenia, you are connected to Brazilian historiography, and I would like to call back in a period when, in the 80s, when we started to translate books such as the Thompson book, The Making of English Working Class, in different left of the new left in England, and so on. And the idea of history from below, it was very, very powerful idea. And it have a very, very strong influence in the shifting of a kind of paradigm in terms of understanding Brazilian history, especially the slavery period, where you consider the agency of the slave going against the big sociological theories that formed a great part of our intellectuals. So I think in this moment, it was 1980 and 1990, we have a renewal of perspective to deal with the Brazilian history. But all this discussion about decolonization, post-colonization, it is only now coming into the field. But we are already discussing these things in social history, labor history, and it was so strong that we have a law in 1999 that became mandatory in the syllabus, in the programs of the schools to teach Afro-Brazilian history and indigenous history. So I think it's really complex when we discuss the shift of this paradigm from the European, the grand narrative of the Occidental history, to different possibilities of understanding the past. Because it has to be connected to the way we teach history. Otherwise, the chief won't have an extension. So the way we teach history, the way we build the textbooks, and it has a lot to do. It's another discussion, but I think it's really connected to the way this renewal can be. And last, so I would like to hear you. Why historians are so against this decolonialization and the colonial perspective, if they, in the field, they do such a kind of perspective, especially in our Latin American historiography. Stefan, it's very interesting, the project. Our laboratory in 1982 started organizing the material, interviewing trade unionists in that were still alive from the strikes during the 20th century. And we organized photograph collections and oral history projects. So I think this is very important also because it connects to the high school and to the basic school with projects. At the same time, we have a very important project with the sites of memory of slavery. City of Rio de Janeiro, the harbor of Valongo became UNESCO historical heritage, and it's very important site of memory. And from this site, there is a tourist walking path that you can go, and it's really, the tourists go there, and you have all these spots where you can, with the QR code, when you can retrieve the data from the place and so on. But also, it became a very important activity for students, for Carioca students. So I think it's important not only to think about media as the final aim, but as a kind of tool to develop and to bring the young people engaged to the history of trade unions, that I think that has a lot to do with neoliberalism, that they want to erase us from the map. So, but we're still here. Thank you very much.
Thank you for these questions. I'm going to give the word first to Eugenia, who also had an additional question, so then she can also ask that, and then we'll go on from there.
I just wanted to add on to Anna's question to Professor Cortés, and I wanted to ask him very specifically what he thinks about Professor Gorman's contribution to the history of Latin America and historiography in general.
Bueno, la pregunta es muy interesante y había que partir explicando algunos conceptos que me parecen fundamentales. Sobre todo, tiene que ver con una gran confusión y lo voy a señalar. Lo que se produce a partir del siglo XVI, siglo XVII, nosotros los hemos tomado como historiografía. Había que hacer la pregunta, ¿será historiografía? Porque, por ejemplo, una carta de relación de Hernán Cortés es una carta al rey. Sin embargo, en la modernidad nosotros lo tomamos como un hecho histórico. No, ese es el primero. Si nos vamos a la condición de la evangelización, por ejemplo, lo que escriben los cronistas religiosos, el más famoso de todos, que es Bernardino de Sahagún, que escribe una crónica sobre los indios de la Nueva España, se ha tomado como la verdad de los indígenas, es decir, lo que dijeron los indígenas, porque supuestamente entrevistó a indígenas. Bueno, sin embargo, revisando estos libros, precisamente, él lo primero que tiene no es una condición de sacar literatura ni hacer historia, es hacer un recuento, porque es un religioso y tiene hermanos de orden. Se necesita evangelizar. Ellos están para evangelizar. Y entonces se ha tomado como las crónicas con las cuales podemos vislumbrar el pasado indígena o el pasado de la conquista. Eso es para un momento. Cuando señaló en el caso del siglo XX, en el caso mexicano, debemos de centrarnos que hay un problema. México, en los años 20, está saliendo del movimiento armado, lo que conocemos como Revolución Mexicana. Obviamente que se está configurando nuevamente la nación y sobre todo lo que se está configurando es una nueva sociedad. Entonces, todo lo que se va a producir es la idea de lo mexicano, no lo indígena, porque esa es la confusión que se tiene, ¿no? Lo mexicano se considera que es la condición de lo indígena, cuando en realidad lo mexicano lo que se está construyendo es la idea de este nuevo mestizaje a partir de las ideas de la Revolución Mexicana. Inclusive mencionó un concepto, la raza cósmica. La raza cósmica es una invención que crea José Vasconcelos. Por cierto, José Vasconcelos no cita a a los pueblos indígenas originarios, sino lo que está construyendo es una idea del nuevo ser mexicano. Va a haber toda una literatura que se va a presentar a lo largo, que tiene que ver, por ejemplo, con Samuel Ramos, la identidad del mexicano, más adelante se va a construir con Octavio Paz va a construir una idea también del mexicano, y sobre todo, en el caso del historiador de la historia, hay una deconstrucción. Por primera vez se entra a debatir problemas que tienen que ver con este pasado. De ahí viene el libro de Edmundo Gorman, La invención de América. Lo que hace Edmundo Gorman es deconstruir la idea de que América fue descubierta. Lo que dice él es que América fue inventada. Precisamente mi ponencia también tiene que ver con esta. ¿Cómo se ha construido la idea de los indígenas? En realidad es una construcción que parte desde Occidente. Es más, el término indio es un término jurídico que establece la corona española. Y sin embargo, hoy en día el término indígena tendría que ponerse en discusión. Claro, hay una población, por cierto, todavía que dice, no, conservemos el término indígena o indio, porque todavía nos da representatividad para defendernos en cuanto a las condiciones de apropiación de terrenos o apropiación de tierras. Entonces, hay algo que debemos empezar a entender, que es que verdaderamente los discursos se deben de entender de acuerdo a cómo surgen en su momento. Es decir, lo que se produce a lo largo del siglo XVI-XVII tiene que observarse de acuerdo a las circunstancias de una sociedad medieval cristiana como está transitando Europa, porque no nada más es España, es una gran mentira. Inclusive el ajuste que tienen con el Concilio de Trento a partir de las ideas de Lutero, en realidad España ya lo había hecho. Es un ajuste que tienen con el mundo medieval. Y regreso. En el caso, nosotros hoy nos centramos a discutir precisamente estos relatos que se produjeron, que se volvieron icónicos, es decir, que se volvieron parte fundamental sin estudiarse, sin comprenderse el sentido que tenía en ese momento, ¿no? Entonces, hablamos de momentos históricos importantísimos, lo que es siglo XVI-XVII, y ya el siglo XX es el ajuste del Estado por revolucionario que trae una nueva idea de nación. Es enfrentarse a otro momento histórico.
Do you want to respond to this?
Go ahead. Oh, okay. We all have to.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's a very good point that we should also connect this to the high schools, and the Gewerkschaft Erziehung und Wissenschaft, which is the main German trade union for education, so it's covering schools but also universities, they are part of this project, and we are also looking specifically at developing materials for the schools, which we can then provide to teachers. The curricula in Germany are relatively, and I stress relatively, flexible in terms of teaching, but I think if we can provide materials to teachers who are often hard-pressed for time, then we also have a greater likelihood that the trade unions and the history of the trade unions will feature more in the schools. So I think that is a very important point. And at the same time, I think this whole idea of a kind of transgenerational passing of the torch, so to speak, in using memory and history in order to tell young people that some of the things that they take for granted today, like, for example, in Germany, if an employee falls ill, that he's on full wages for 4 months before it becomes reduced, that this doesn't fall from heaven, but that it needed a sort of 3-month-long strike of the German trade unions in the 1950s to pressurize the parliament to push this law through parliament. So I think these things are are important to acquaint a new generation with. And I think we have this task in all of the countries, and certainly in my discussions with trade unionists and scholars who are close to trade unions like myself in other countries, it's already clear that we will also benefit enormously from a transnational discussion of what the trade unions are doing in that respect. And I mean, Brazil, my closest contacts are Paulo Fontes and Larissa Correa, and they also brought in a whole host of trade unionists into the discussion. So I think Brazil will be very well represented in that project.
Thank you. Anna. Wow, well, that's very tough. I think we have to analyze this whole development of historiography of Latin America for every moment of the history of historiography. But I think what you mentioned is the arrival of history from below, and especially Thompson's arrival in Latin America, not only in Brazil. I think it's a general thing. I don't know anything about Chile, truth be told, but I know about other countries like Uruguay and Colombia and Brazil and Argentina and even Paraguay, and I know a little bit about Bolivia, and I know it was a general reception of history from below because finally we had a way to accommodate things that were impossible for us to say in the traditional historical ways. We had a theory that we could use to give agency to not only to slaves, but also to other, like labor history took it and embraced it. And I think what was most important about Thompson's reception in Latin America was the concept of experience. We were finally able to relate local experiences to what we understood was a general theory of the development of economic history. But that's what happened. We built cases of specific experiences. We contributed to the building of history as a general history that has one path, one main path, and then can be we can make contributions to which through establishing cases of different experiences. What we did not take at that time, and it was almost contemporary, was the feminist criticism of experience, where experience was not something essentialized, but it was something to be thought about as previous to the subject. And that is something that did not take hold for some reason. Not in the same way as Thompson. I grew up with Thompson. I was formed by history from below and Thompson and Hobsbawm and all these people. And also the French, of course. The teaching of it, I think we have to start over. I think even though I don't agree with some of the tenets that were exposed here yesterday I can't remember whose talk it was. That was talking about the new ways of teaching history and how we can. But he was right about this person that was exposing yesterday. I think he was from the Czech Republic. He was saying that we need to start thinking about history not as a collection of facts that we can teach to build national identity or communal identity or the idea of a common past, but we need to start thinking about history as a way to teach students to think critically, and that would completely change the way we teach history, especially in schools. The opposition to the decolonial, I think it comes mainly for two reasons. Why? One is we don't think about the decolonial tradition. We're not thinking about Rodolfo Kusch and Quijano, and we're not thinking about them. We're thinking about Chakrabarty and Said, and that we can't relate to that. It's post-colonial and not decolonial. I think we have to recognize the difference between those two projects and also the compatibility between those two programs. I think that's it. Thank you. Agency.
All right, on agency, and my comment was like, okay, let's look at this theory of presence, and I had the impression that we didn't really think about the agency behind this acts of presentification, all of that stuff. And what I am suspecting, again, is that we, again, kind of as a stowaway, we put this conception of the transitivity of subject towards an object, in this case the present, extending itself towards the past, and the ever-presence of media instances, the floor in which you walk on, the coins with which you transact or do transactions, I don't know how to say that. They also are part of this messy, convoluted agency of this context between past and present. And so my suggestion is to reconceptualize the idea of presence not only as let's go towards the past, let's immerse ourselves in the past, but instead let's see how the past itself is immersed in us, and try to find ways of synchronizing or finding the same radio station with the past. And it's kind of like walking in a sea of molasses. It's very complicated, but again, it has to do with our incapability of actually accessing the past as if through a window, but instead of realizing how it is already, always already with us.
Great, we don't have too much time left, so I suggest Zoltan and Alison that you both ask your questions straightly behind each other, and then we'll have the speakers answer.
Okay, I will try to be quick, especially because I will still need to make my way home, because the next session, I'm still at the university, and the next 2 sessions actually I will be also involved, so I will try to be quick. And very many thanks everybody for the presentation. I would like to have asked a question to Eugenia. It's not really a question, it was a great talk. It's I really like the idea of seeking for points of connection, right? But it comes with tremendous difficulties, even more difficulties probably than at the moment, or what the talk suggested. I mean, and the first is that having a relation to the past doesn't necessarily mean, and that also relates back to Ugo's comment, having a relation to the past does not necessarily mean having a historical relation. And then probably Ashish Nandi's text from History and Theory from 1995, in which he makes the case for explicitly seeking for ahistorical constructions of the past as an alternative to Western historicity. And then he also makes a claim that there is only one way to be historical and so many ways of being ahistorical. I think he's wrong. I think there are many ways to be historical as well. And I think that could be a point of connection. But at the same time, you need to recognize that, yes, there are non-historical constructions of the past as well. But so that's just one complexity. And then the other thing is that, yes, you are right, post-colonial, decolonial theories are totally different, but I think they are recognized at least to a certain extent. But at the same time, there are also parts of the world, for example, where I come from, which is, not even the decolonial vocabulary has much to say about it, right? And I'm sitting in Eastern Europe, and it's not the global South, it's not the global North. Actually, I'm sitting now in Germany, but generally speaking. So it's not the global South, not the global North. And the vocabulary of extractivism and stuff like that also just doesn't really make sense. There is no original land taken away. Every piece of land has belonged to hundreds of political constitutions over the years. And you go 100 kilometers to any direction, people speak different languages. It's not like speaking Spanish 500 million people. If I speak now my mother tongue, nobody would understand it. If Marek would speak his mother tongue, that would be even 10 times less people understanding it. And also sitting here in Germany, I also had the feeling that by now, also German academia knows more about post-colonial and decolonial theories than the word that begins over the border to Poland and the Czech Republic. And that's another complexity, that this global North, global South doesn't necessarily encompass something. So if seeking connections has to be a bit more in a network thinking, more like in a sense of a sense of relationality. And on that note, so what came to my mind, how to do that? That's just tremendously difficult, right? And then if you just pick up on one question, what came to my mind, of course, there is the, the dictionary of, the Grundbegriffe, right? So to have a sort of a, the conceptual history project, which is not only looking for these fundamental notions or concepts as they are changing over time, focused on Germany in this case, but this sort of a fundamental concept or points of connection with their totally different and changing meanings, but nevertheless being there transculturally, so also in a spatial way to, so let's say a transcultural sort of, big conceptual history project, how would that work? Would that work at all? But also in a sort of a relational connectivity way. But it's again very difficult, and again that would be, of course, that was a project in one of the centers of knowledge production, right? So that would reproduce an idea that came about, at some point in Western academia. But again, is that necessarily a problem? No, that's also not necessarily a problem. So. Yeah, I just wanted to say that it's super difficult, but to make a project out of it, this point of connection, that would be just awesome. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you, I guess.
Alison?
Thank you so much, and I'll be brief because I know that we're just about out of time here. I want to thank you all for those papers. And my comment is somewhat directed at Eugenia, but it's really, I wanted to just sort of connect the kind of argument that you're making here to some of the discussions we were having yesterday. Tyson Retz on progress and Tena Mariano on empathy. And I think that, kind of what I am hearing here is a grappling with the problem of what we do with these very powerful concepts and ways of organizing thoughts that bring with them, lots of they bring, colonial importations, they express power relations and ideology. And it poses, I think, a really significant challenge to figure out whether it's possible to redeploy these concepts and practices, or whether they, in and of themselves, are structured in such a way that renders them bankrupt. And I think, this is an important discussion to have. And I guess I'll just sort of leave it at that. But I did want to sort of connect this discussion to the one from yesterday, because I think a lot of the same kinds of questions and issues have been raised in both contexts. So thank you very much.
Well, very briefly, well, Zoltan, that sounds like a 3-day bar conversation. But so I will only say 2 things, very to the point. One is conceptual history program is probably the best example of what not to be done, what should not be done. The idea, when you see the whole project and the results of the project, what you see is the endless repetition of 3 words. Subtle sight, experience, space of experience, and expectations horizon. And these 3 categories cannot account for the multiplicity of experiences that the project of conceptual, the history of concepts wants to embark on. It's exactly what the problem with using these general concepts to apply them to all other cultures and ways of developing what some people call progress, and what maybe should not be called progress, because progress is a very problematic category. It doesn't mean the same when you say progress in Europe and when you say progress in Latin America. I have no idea about Eastern Europe, for instance, but that's something that can be built. It has a very negative connotation when you say progress in some places in Latin America. It is related to loss of jobs, to poverty, to being taken over by an organization that just does not consider the poor at all. So progress can be very, very negative in some parts of the world. So this is exactly the kind of things that I think we should discuss. How do we see these different these concepts that might share the word, but have nothing to do in their meaning? And I think what I finally want to say, and I'm sorry, Alison, I think I want to like put this as an answer to you as well, especially because we have no time. I think what's been the most wrong about this, the way we think about building history, and there is an assumption here, of course. I am assuming that we have a common goal. I am assuming that all historians want to understand human experience in the world. That we all want to do that. I am assuming that. Maybe we're not. Maybe we should think about that too. But I think the way to do it should not be thinking about global, not the global south, not the global north. It's not about that. It's about going into every specific individual experience, how all these relationships, meaningful relationships are built based on concepts that are assumed to mean something that maybe they don't. Tradition again. Tradition, you can see tradition in Latin America, but it's in Europe too. Look at Gadamer, he has a positive vision of tradition. And we don't discuss that. We only discuss the illustrated notion of tradition that is absolutely negative, here in Latin America, for instance. But anyway, long conversation, I'm sorry. I wish I could have answered.
Yeah, no, and that's exactly what I meant. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Great. I think that's a perfect, inspiring answer to end with. Thank you for this great panel. Thank you also for the people at home joining us. I think we deserve lunch, and we'll see you again in an hour.
Lunch.
Thank you.
Thank
Really
you.
interesting.
That was. I had a question for you too. Are you planning to? Well, first, Bismarck. Seriously, why?
Recording stopped.
Created some of the first social legislation